Today's episode is brought to you by Isaac Yuen's Utter Earth, a collection of essays which Elizabeth Bradfield calls infectious, a light, literary take on an animal book for grown-ups, a tongue-in-cheek self-help column with lessons drawn from nature, a sort of hitchhiker's guide to the more than human world. Utter Earth is a celebration, through wordplay and earthplay, of our planet's riotous wonders, highlighting life that once was, still is, and all that we stand to lose. This living and lively mini encyclopedia shines the spotlight on the motley, fantastical, and astonishing denizens with whom we share this planet. Utter Earth is out from West Virginia University Press. Today's episode is also brought to you by Porrick O'Donnell's The Naming of the Birds, the next installment following the acclaimed bestseller The House on Vesper Sands. The series has been called by the Wall Street Journal an enchantment, transforming a chronicle of sordid crimes into an enjoyably eerie ghost story, and by the Star Tribune, a tour de force that dexterously blends the drama of Dickens, the sensationalism of Wilkie Collins, and the mystery of Conan Doyle, following the antics of Inspector Cutter and Sergeant Bliss as they solve their strangest and most personal case yet. The Naming of the Birds is hypnotic and twisty, ensnaring readers until the final pages, where they are left questioning what matters most, solving a case or serving justice. The Naming of the Birds is out January 7th from Tin House and available for pre-order now. It seems fitting for the last episode of 2024 to echo back to the first one, to end the year together the way we began. Our first episode of the year was an archival recording from 2003, from the first year of the Tin House Summer Writers Workshop. It was a 3-part episode of Denis Johnson, first giving a reading from his novella Train Dreams, then being interviewed by Chris Offutt about his process and philosophy. And finally, after Denis takes a cigarette break, Charles D'Ambrosio and Chris Offutt join him in performing the first act of Johnson's play Psycho's Never Dream. Today we are bringing the year to a close with Denis's return to the workshop the following summer, the summer of 2004. Just over 20 years ago now, where for the first 30 minutes, Denis introduces and then does an extended reading from his as of yet unpublished book, Tree of Smoke, a book that ultimately becomes a finalist for the 2008 Pulitzer Prize for Fiction and wins the 2007 National Book Award for Fiction. Jeff Dyer at the time called Tree of Smoke a whopping megaton novel, 600 pages with a zillion characters, and with a plot that offers a key to the variously contested mythologies of American involvement in Southeast Asia. A book that he compares to a monster in the Frankenstein sense. A novel, quote, jolted constantly into life by its own damaged circuitry, a mass of spare parts all held together with a relentlessly deranged sense of purpose. It is as if his skewed relationship to the sentence, not really knowing what one is, and yet knowing exactly what to do with it, operates here at the level of structure. Tree of Smoke is as excessive and messy as Moby Dick. Anything further removed from the tucked-up hospital corner school of British fiction is hard to imagine. It's a big, dirty, unmade bed of a book, and once you settle in, you're in no hurry to get out. I bring this review up because in the intro to the last episode with Argentinian writer Rodrigo Fresán, who by coincidence is also the translator into Spanish of Denis Johnson's Jesus' Son, I wonder out loud in that intro if I'm in the middle of a Melville trend on the show, with Fresán's book Melville, of course, but in the episode before that with Dion Brand talking about Melville's Benito Sereno, and now perhaps with Denis Johnson's Moby Dick of a novel, himself. But I'm also thinking of Dyer's description of this book offering a key into the variously contested mythologies of American involvement in Southeast Asia. And thinking of that, I wondered what past between the covers guest Viet Thanh Nguyen thought about Johnson's Tree of Smoke, given that I can think of no other person who has thought more about representations of Vietnam in books and in films, both within his own fiction and also within his nonfiction, than Viet Thanh Nguyen. In his review of another Vietnam novel called Matterhorn by Karl Marlantes, he says the following, comparing Matterhorn and Tree of Smoke, quote, "The two novels represent the fork in the road for talking about the Vietnam War from American viewpoints. One, Matterhorn, that says Americans weren't so bad to anybody as they were to each other, and one, Tree of Smoke, that says, actually, Americans really were as bad as the rest of the world thought them to be. The discouraging thing is that many, perhaps most Americans, really believe in the former. The encouraging thing is that enough Americans believe in the latter for there to be an ongoing debate." End quote. After this 30-minute reading, Denis is joined on stage by Charles D'Ambrosio for a deep dive into Denis's craft and philosophy, questions of influence and ethics, and more. Before I hand it over to Denis, as we end the year and begin again anew, do consider, if you enjoy what you've heard this year, if it's inspired you, informed you, or helped you get through, consider transforming yourself from a listener to a listener supporter. Everyone who joins the Between the Covers community is invited to help shape the future of the show, and everyone receives the resources related to each episode, of what I discovered while preparing to where to explore once you're done listening. And then there are a ton of other things to choose from beyond this, from the Tin House Early Reader subscription to the bonus audio archive full of supplementary readings, performances, and craft talks. You can find out about it all at patreon.com/betweenthecovers. And now for today's archival episode from the summer of 2004 with none other than Denis Johnson.
Thanks, Rob. And thanks to Lee and Wynn and everyone connected with this wonderful gathering this week. I'm a little more involved this time than I was last summer. It's been a real privilege. I'm not zipping my fly down here. I'm trying to get my watch. I'm trying to get my watch off the watch chain, that's all. Just want you all to be sure about that. I think what I'll do is read the second chapter from a novel I've been working on. Yeah, Chris Offutt is laughing because I was going to read the first chapter, but it involves shooting a person who shoots an animal. And last night, Chris Offutt read a chapter of his memoir which involved a person shooting an animal. And I thought we need a little variety in this thing. So I'm going to read the second chapter, and I actually don't have to fill you in much, but just to demonstrate to myself that I think I understand what the novel is about, or at least how it's structured. It takes place between 1963 and 1983 in the Philippines, North and South Philippines, and Vietnam, South Vietnam, and in Malaysia. And it sort of goes from 1963 to 1972 or so. Then there's a gap, and then it picks up again in 1983. There are lots of different characters, and I I think it's going to be incredibly long. I have a little sign on my wall that says, if it's 2,000 pages in 200 years, so be it. So far, as I mentioned this afternoon, it's been 22 years. So we're only, 1978 to go. So the characters, the only thing they have really in common with each other is that they all seem to come into contact with an American retired colonel who now works for the Central Intelligence Agency, and his name is Francis Sands. And so in a way, this is something like the Jesus Son short story book, only kind of the mirror image. People often write to me. In fact, just the other day, my Japanese translator wrote me an email and said, I have always really liked the novel Jesus Son, which is what he's translating. He doesn't seem to realize it's just a book of short stories, but many people refer to it as a novel. It's kind of a novel disguised as a book of short stories. And I think this may be a book of short stories disguised as a novel. So there's not a lot of connectedness, except that people sort of seem to run across this one man throughout the book. And it's never from his point of view. It's always from other people's point of view. So this is the second chapter. It takes place in 1964. Huiyan Hao arrived safely at the New Star Temple on his new Japanese motorbike, in dress pants and a box-cut shirt, wearing sunglasses, the pomade melting in his hair. It was his sad errand to serve as his family's only representative at the funeral service for his nephew. Hao's wife, the boy's aunt, was down with the chills. The boy's parents were deceased, and the boy's only brother was flying missions for the Air Force. Hao looked back to where he'd dropped off a friend from his youth named Tran Van, whom everybody had always called the monk, and who'd gone north when the country had been partitioned. Hao hadn't seen the monk for a decade, not until this afternoon, and now he was gone. He'd hopped backward off the bike, removed his sandals, and padded off barefoot down the path. Hao made sure to take the motorbike slowly over anything looking like a puddle, and when he reached the rice paddies, he walked the machine most carefully along the berms. He had to keep his clothes clean. He'd be overnighting here, probably in the schoolroom adjacent to the temple. The village wasn't far from Saigon, and in better times he might have motored back in the dusk. But the critical areas had expanded such that nowadays, any time after 3 p.m., any of the back roads over to Route 22 would be hazardous. He set his straw bedroll on the earthen floor just inside the schoolroom's doorway so as to be able to find his bed later in the night. The string of huts was lifeless except for foraging chickens and stationary old women visible in the doorways. He pulled aside the wooden lid of the concrete well and lowered the bucket and drew himself a drink and a wash from out of the dark. The well was deep, drilled by a machine. The water came clear and cool into his hands and onto his face. The temple was silent. The master probably napped. Hao rolled his motorbike into the interior, rough lumber with a roof of ceramic shingles and a dirt floor about 15 by 15 meters, not much bigger in area than the downstairs of Hao's own home in Saigon. Rather than disturb the master, he turned and went out even before his eyes adjusted. But already, the must of the floor and the aroma of joss sticks had wakened his boyhood, when he'd served here at the temple for a couple of years. He felt something tugging at him from that era, a thread connected to a sadness that was generally inert and quickly forgot itself. So much of this had been laid over by the rest of his life. And then also he felt a confused sadness over his nephew's preposterous death. Inconceivable. On first hearing of it, Hao had assumed the boy had perished in an accidental fire. But in fact, he'd burned himself alive, as had 2 or 3 elder monks in recent times. But those others had been far advanced along their spiritual paths, and they'd killed themselves spectacularly in the Saigon streets in order to cry out against chaos. T was only 22, and he'd set himself afire out in the bush beyond the village in a solitary ceremony. Incomprehensible, crazy. Suicide? A a primitive form of human sacrifice? When Master woke, he came out not in his robe, but dressed for the fields. Hal stood up and bowed his head, and the Master bowed very deeply. A small man with a large rib cage and stick limbs, his head covered with stubble. It occurred to Hal that T had probably been the one who'd shaved him. Poor dead T. I was going to take up a hoe this afternoon, the Master said. I'm glad you've stopped me. They sat on the porch and made polite talk, moving into the doorway while a loud rain came over. The Master apparently chose to let the chatter of this downpour serve the purposes of small talk, because he spoke immediately of the death of T, saying it mystified him. But it brings you back to see us. Every fist grips its gift. The atmosphere of the temple is very strong, Hal said. You always seemed uncertain here. But I'm doing what you suggested. I've made my doubt into my calling. That's not quite the way to phrase it. Those were the words you used. No, I said you must allow your doubt to become your calling. You must permit it. I don't suggest that you make it so, but that you only let it be so. Let your doubt be your calling. Then your doubt will be invisible. You'll inhabit it like an atmosphere. The Master offered a bit of champui, which Hal declined. Master put the spicy dried fruit in his own mouth and chewed and sucked vigorously, frowning. A certain American is coming to the service. Yes, the Colonel. The Master said nothing, and Hal felt forced to go on. The Colonel knows my nephew Min. They met in the Philippines. He told me so, yes. Have you met him personally? He's come several times. He cultivated an acquaintance with T. I think he's a kind man, or at least a careful man. He's interested in the practice. He wants to study the breath. His breath smells of the meat of cattle and cigars and liquor. And what about you? Have you continued with the breath? Hal didn't answer. Have you continued your practice? No. The Master spat out the pit of the champui he'd been sucking. A skeletal puppy darted from under the porch and gobbled it quickly, trembling, and dematerialized. In their dreams, dogs travel back and forth between this world and the other world. In their dreams, they visit the before life and they visit the afterlife. Hal said, the Americans are going to become somewhat active here, somewhat destructive. How do you know? The question was very indiscreet, yet in the face of Hal's silence, he persisted. Did this American tell you? T's brother told me. Min, our Air Force will participate. Will he bomb his own country? Min doesn't fly a bomber. But will the Air Force destroy us? Min told me to get you out of here. I can't tell you more than that because it's all I know. Because to traffic in information any more specific than that terrified him, would have terrified anyone, should have terrified the Master. Hal raised another matter. I just saw the monk. He showed up at my house and asked me for money. Then I took him here on the back of the motorbike. The Master only studied him with his eyes. Yes, he'd known the Master must have heard from Tron. How long since you've seen him? Not long, the Master admitted. How long has he been back? Who can say? And you, how long since you've seen him? Several years. He has a northern accent now. Hal stopped himself from saying more, stared at his feet. It disturbed you to see him. He came to my house. He wanted money for the cause. For the Viet Minh, they don't take taxes in the city. If he asked, they must have told him to. It's extortion. Then he insisted I take him here on the motorbike. The Master said, he knows he's safe. He knows you won't name him to his enemies. Maybe I should. If the Viet Minh have their way, that means the destruction of my family business. And of our temple, probably. But Diem is destroying the country. I can't give money to the communists. Maybe I can get word to him that you have no money, that you've spent it for something. What? Something that puts you beyond reproach. Yes, tell him something, please. I'll just say you've done what you can. I'm indebted. Howe could feel tomorrow morning's mist beginning to shape itself almost immediately as the sun fell behind the nearest hill to the west, called Good Luck Mountain. The fortunes of the mountain had altered, however. The construction arm of the American military was making an encampment up there. Most people guessed a permanent landing zone for helicopters. News had reached his ears that they planned to distribute mixtures alongside Route 1 to kill the vegetation there. Depriving ambushers of cover was a good idea, he thought. But this was the loveliest country on the earth. Sorrow and war lay all over it, true, but the sickness of sorrow had never before penetrated the land itself. He didn't like to see it poisoned. On account of this colonel's possible arrival, they delayed T's memorial until past 4 in the afternoon. But the American didn't come, and the possibility of ambush would keep him off the roads now, so they went ahead without him. They held the service in the temple. 8 of the neighboring villagers attended, 7 old men and someone's grandchild, sitting in candlelight around the temple's centerpiece without a corpse to look at, only a small crowd of bric-a-brac items, mostly wooden Buddhas painted gold. A scintillating battery-run decoration of the type found in GI taverns topped the whole display, a disc on which changing bands of light revolved clockwise. The master was more than audible. He spoke as if he were teaching, as if nobody ever learned anything. We Vietnamese have 2 philosophies to sustain us. The Confucian tells us how to behave when fate grants us peace and order. The Buddhist trains us to accept our fate, even when it brings us blood and chaos. The Americans arrived by last light in an open jeep. Either they had no fear of the roads, or they'd bivouacked with the American military construction group above on Good Luck Mountain. The colonel had the wheel, in civilian dress as always, driving with a rifle jutting up between his knees, smoking a cigar, accompanied by a U.S. infantryman, and also by a Vietnamese woman in a white blouse and gray skirt, whom he introduced as Mrs. Van, an employee of the U.S. Information Service. They'd brought a projector and a collapsible screen and intended to show a movie to the people of the village. The colonel bowed to the master, and then they shook hands vigorously in the American way. Mr. Wien, we're going to set up the projector in the main room, if that's all right. Will you please tell him that? Howe translated and told the colonel that the master saw no obstacle. The young soldier arranged the machine, the cords, and 4 folding canvas chairs for the elders, the colonel said, as well as a small generator which he set going a few meters beyond the temple's wooden walls and which filled the valley with its racket and scented the whole region with its exhaust. Howe explained that he and the master had to visit a sick villager, but might come to see part of the film later on. The colonel said he understood, but Howe wasn't sure he did. And as dusk arrived, and then the darkness, and as it grew evident that nobody at all would come, the colonel asked to have the film run just for himself. The movie machine, powered by the noisy generator, filled the temple with flickering illumination and a hollow booming voice and strident music. The film, Years of Lightning, Day of Thunder, recounted the brief, tragic, heroic span of President John F. Kennedy. The soldier and Mrs. Van also watched. Mrs. Van had come along to translate the narrative for the audience, but of course there was no need. The colonel had said it would go on for 55 minutes, and 5 minutes short of that, under cover of the darkness, Howe and the master crept in to join the American, the master sitting on his pillow at the head of the room behind the portable screen, where he couldn't see anything, actually, and Howe in a chair beside the young soldier. Mrs. Van, sitting behind the colonel, glanced at Howe, but seemed to decide he could translate for himself. In fact, he couldn't. To fathom English speech, he usually needed faces and gestures. And anyway, the colonel was already talking more loudly than the film, sitting with his arms crossed over his fists, addressing himself in bitter tones to the shining spectacle as the music swelled and the view closed in on the eternal flame marking John F. Kennedy's grave, a squat torch which the Americans intended to keep alight forever. The eternal flame, the colonel said. Eternal? If you can kill the man, you can sure as hell kill his flame. The thing is this, we're all dead in the long run. In the end, we're dirt. Let's face it, our whole civilization is a layer of sediment. In the end, some mongrel barbarian wakes up in the morning and stands with one foot on a rock and the other on the kicked-over vessel of Kennedy's eternal flame. And the vessel is cold and dead, and that son of a bitch doesn't even know he's standing on it. He's just taking a piss in the morning. When I get up in the morning and step behind the tent to break wind and void my bladder, whose grave am I pissing on? Mr. Wien, is my English too fast? Am I getting across? Howe made out the colonel's intent. And yes, he wanted to agree, it's all simply water coursing into larger and then yet larger seas, and only what we do in this moment can save us. His vocabulary allowed him to say, "It's true, I think so, yes." Both men were distracted now by a small rat or frog that hopped boldly into the room through the front door. The colonel astonished Howe by reacting to this intrusion violently, flinging himself bodily at the small man and knocking him backward, chair and all, so that the back of Howe's head struck the packed dirt floor, and pain burst over his sight like an explosion of freezing needles. His vision cleared as a small object, for that is what it was and not some rodent, stopped only a meter from his face, and he understood it was probably a grenade. It was his death. Something clapped down over the grenade. The soldier had covered it with his helmet and now lowered himself, not rapidly, but with some reluctance, and lay down on the helmet, staring at first at the dirt of the floor and then looking toward Wien's face only inches away so that his eyes were readable as he curled himself around his terror. Long seconds passed in an immense silence. More long seconds. The silence held. The soldier's face did not change, and he didn't breathe. But his soul came back into his eyes, and he stared now at Wien with some comprehension. Wien became aware that the colonel lay across his chest, had thrown himself there just as the soldier had thrown himself over the helmet. He became aware of pain in his calves, his head, of the big American colonel's weight. Wien sucked hard at the air. He was suffocating. The soldier himself exhaled the air he'd been harboring, and Wien felt the soldier's breath bathe his face. Now the colonel placed his palms on the floor either side of Wien's shoulders and heaved himself up onto his knees, and Wien was able to fill his lungs. The colonel gripped the soldier's arm, put his other hand on his own knee, stood up like a very old man. "Nothing happening, son." The soldier was deaf. Get up, son. Come on now, son, get up." The youngster, finding life in his body, overcame some of his shock and managed to roll himself over. Quickly, the colonel lifted the helmet aside, scooped up the hand grenade, tossed it underhanded toward the doorway, but it struck the wall and it made it only as far as the threshold, and he said, "Damn it all." He approached it, bent and gripped it firmly, and strode out the door to the well. He moved the lid aside and tossed the device into the depths. The others followed him out, perhaps inadvisedly. Mrs. Van tended to the soldier, talking rapid English, brushing at his shirt and trousers energetically, almost hysterically, as if battering at flames. When she was done, she started in on Howe, swiping at the dirt on the back of his shirt. "These are bad people," she said in English. "This is what happens with these horrible people." The master came out of the temple. From his place behind the screen, he'd witnessed almost nothing. When Howe told him about the grenade, he took 2 long steps backward, away from the lip of the well. The colonel said, "Look, I'm sorry, the well was the quickest place to come to mind." Howe translated the colonel's apology and then the master's reply. "I believe it's safe. If that grenade goes off, it's going to muck up your water." The master said, "Later it will become calm again." "That thing must be deep, and is it concrete?" "Yes," Howe said, "concrete constructed." "It's top-notch." "Top-notch?" "It's very well made." "Yes, it was placed by the Swiss Red Cross." "When was this?" "I don't know when." The colonel said, "They heard that noisy goddamn generator, didn't they?" By way of an answer, Howe pursed his lips. Howe stood by politely while the visitors reloaded their gear and radioed the encampment on Good Luck Mountain. "We'll scoot on up the hill," the colonel said. "Yes, there it's more secure," Howe agreed. In minutes, a patrol of 3 jeeps arrived and many soldiers, and the convoy roared away into the night. Hal crept into the schoolroom and felt along the wall for a nail. He undressed and hung up his shirt and trousers, swept his straw mat with his hands, unrolled 2 yards of linen to hide under from the mosquitoes. The master heard him from the other side of the wall in the temple and called good night. Hal replied softly and lay back in his shorts and undershirt in the pitch dark, pillowing his head on his plastic Japanese sandals. This colonel, Hal had never encountered him in a uniform. It seemed fitting. Somehow he thought of all Americans as civilians, although in his entire life he'd only seen government Americans and military Americans, and a few missionaries. Just the same, he thought of Americans as cowboys. He still felt astonished by the young soldier's courage. Maybe it was good that they'd come to Vietnam. But even through the wall, he could feel the master's anger at himself for dealing with the colonel. The American was attractive, fascinating, but the Americans were, in the end, just another horde of puppet masters. The curtain falls on the French, the curtain rises, now the American puppet drama. But the time of slaves and puppets was over. 1,000 years under China, then the French domination, all of it finished. Now comes freedom. Hal spoke softly to Master. He wished him lucky dreams. He himself trembled and couldn't sleep. His bowels smoldered with fear. What if another grenade rolled in out of the night? Listening for his murderers, he became aware of the oppressive life of the jungle, of the collective roar of insects as big as any cities at noon. He felt as if a curse lay over everything. His wife was sick, his nephew was dead, the wars would never stop. He found his slippers with his feet and went out to the well and drank from the can in the dark and recollected himself. Nothing could hurt him. He'd lived, he'd known love, he'd raised children. Lucky life. He cooled his depths with water from the depths of Vietnam. After rolling the device into the Joss house, Tron turned and ran behind the row of huts as quietly as he could and entered the trail. Only a few meters along, he slowed down, listening. Voices, movement, but no blast. A minute, 2 minutes. If the noise had come, he still might not have heard it for the booming of his blood. He stood in the middle of the narrow thoroughfare with his arms wrapped around his middle, hunched and trembling, grief wringing itself out of him. He hadn't expected the fools to be sitting there next to the American. He hadn't wept in years. If I'd actually killed them, I might weep less. This outpouring was good. The old women said, "Scatter your tears, they're good for the crops." He moved on down the path. In Saigon, they'd given him only the one grenade. Well, he'd been told to wait for the American civilian who brought the film projector, a specific target. He hadn't asked why then they hadn't sent a good shot with a rifle. He guessed the American's death was meant to seem incidental. He had to take to the creek briefly to get around a hamlet where lived some noisy dogs. Heading downstream, he reached the house of the region's head cadre. The occupants were sleeping. In the tiny garden behind it, he squatted with his rump against a tree trunk, draped his head with a rag, and put his face down onto his knees. He rested for 2 hours. He didn't know why he'd asked his old friend Hal for funds. He didn't think he should examine his motives. He hadn't been instructed to initiate any contact. Just before dawn, he woke the cadre and reported his failure. He was issued a rifle and 2 banana clips holding altogether 60 rounds and told to go back to the encampment of ragtag boys by the Van Kodong River, a lost command of Hoa Hao guerrillas. They'd declared themselves ready to submit to relocation and indoctrination. "Has there been any trouble?" he asked the cadre. "No one has harmed them. You won't encounter any tensions." "All right, keep the gun." The river was high. Tron had to make his way to a ford well below the encampment, cross over, and hike back downstream some 5 or 6 kilometers overall. He hooted as he came to an outpost, a lean-to of banana leaves and poles, but no one answered. The path led to a black-scarred region close by the river, formerly a market square. The people here had been driven out by a plague, and later a practitioner had ordered the buildings burned in a superstitious ceremony. A small barn nearby still stood upright and now served as a barracks. The youngsters were out back of the structure burying one of their comrades. A 2-week bout of malaria had ended in his extinction. They'd stripped him of his clothes. They sprinkled grains of rice into his open mouth, lowered the naked youth into a grave about 4 feet deep without any kind of casket, and covered him up. Tran stood by watching, waving the black flies away from his face. The boys gathered around the mound in silence for about a minute. Finally, one spoke up. "Yes," he said, "there goes one more of us." They were all young, many still in their teens. This was a ridiculous situation. Their group had never been part of the Viet Minh. They were ignorant mountain people from Ba Den who didn't know how to bury their dead. When they were done, he stood with them out back of their barracks to address them, but he could only repeat what others had already said before. "We can get you medicine against malaria. It's possible we can relocate you north to a collective farm we call a kolkhoz, where you'll live in peace and order. But if you want to go on fighting, we can put you to better use than this. We are centralized. We have an iron structure. We are closed into a single fist that disappears up a sleeve when it has to. Our will is unshakable. Our will is our weapon. The greatest materialist, colonialist armies can't stand against it. We drove out the French and will drive out the Americans and will slaughter and bury their puppets. Do they claim victories? Let them. The colonialists are fighting the waves, and no matter how many waves they beat down, the ocean of our resolve is always there. Do you want to be free? Personal liberation is national liberation. The men who led you in the beginning understood this. They learned it with the Hoa Hao, and they took you this far. Now you must come with us and go through to the end, which is the beginning we have all hoped for, the first day of our national freedom." Tran had been sent here because of the time he'd spent serving at the New Star Temple in the nearby village. It was assumed he probably knew these people. A slight mix-up. They'd been recruited into the Hoa Hao as little children, orphan boys from far upriver, and their leaders had abandoned them or been killed. They'd worked their way farther and farther down the Van Co Dong, finding no welcome anywhere, and finally stopping along this stretch, well known in the region for its particularly virulent strain of malaria called piss blood. Nobody bothered them while one by one they died. Tran explained that his own people came from Saigon and Ben Tre, but he'd spent years and years in the north. Right now, until reunification, the heart of Vietnam lay in the north. After reunification, all of Vietnam will be our home. Millions of square kilometers of Vietnam with no partition, no relocation, no disruption of the national fabric. We will lie down at night in peace and wake up to another day of peace. And those of us who die on the way, like your friend, will find peace in the grave. It had been long enough since he'd stopped attending classes that he didn't know anymore what he was saying. "What will it be like on the kolkhoz farm? I've spent some years on a farm in the north. It's a simple life. If you want work, there you'll have work and freedom. But we've been on our own a long time. We're free now. On the farm, it's a different kind of freedom." Yes, 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 nothing but crap. What a monstrosity. He cursed himself for participating. Die here, die there, he wanted to say. Just stay away from the kolkhoz. Thanks. I want to thank you all for letting me read that. I haven't read that before, and I'm aware that one's it's a long stretch of, well, there are very few Americanisms in it, and it's a lot of prose, long paragraphs, and I appreciate your patience. It's always good to read those things, though, because suddenly phrases leap out at you just as you're about to read them, and you think, God, I wish I hadn't put that in there. And so then,
yeah, you can do what Chris does. I mean, he just brings a pen up there to, start scratching stuff
Chris
out.
actually stole my pen a little earlier.
Okay, we're going to ask some questions here. I was apparently, and I apologize to Lee. I was supposed to be doing the introduction, which I, of course, for some reason, fouled that up. And the one thing I did, if I was going to give an introduction, which I'll do now, is I was in a Walden Books once. Those kind of suburban bookstores. Not particularly complete bookstores. And for some reason, I was in the spiritual, inspirational section, just kind of wandering around. I don't know, what kind of day I was having, but anyway, I was in that section in a suburban Walden Books. And, there are all those books like Go to the Light and The Unicorn at the End of the Tunnel and, all of those books. And I was just kind of staring at it blankly, and they have all those yellow and the pink covers and stuff, and there was one little thin black spine in the middle of that, and it was Jesus' son. And I thought, oh, being a good boy, I thought, well, I know where that belongs, and it's that other section, it's the literary section. And I thought, well, I'll just leave it here. But so Denis is kind of graciously, I checked with him beforehand. I'm going to ask the kind of questions that I think that some of the students or attendees want to kind of talk about. And unfortunately, they're kind of, like, how do you do it? Or quoting one of my students, how the fuck do you do it? They're very hard to answer, and I think maybe sometimes the most honest answer is probably, I don't know. But you didn't fly all the way to hear that, so we're going to kind of put him through this.
Well, that sort of takes the wind out of my sails, doesn't it? Yeah. So we won't be giving the honest answer.
Yeah. Did you always read a lot? Since, and I'm going to quote Chris here, but writing and reading are sort of a twin activities.
Yeah, I did when I was young, particularly as a child. I'm of the first TV generation. I was born in 1949, and I think my family had a TV maybe in 1954 or 5 when I was 6 years old. But they didn't let me stay up late. And I was one of those kids who'd go to school. I went to the first grade in the States. And when I'd go to school, everybody would be talking about Wyatt Earp last night and Gunsmoke and some of these shows, and I hadn't been allowed to stay up late enough to see them. So I wasn't really interested in the TV that was on before that. On Saturday, I liked the cartoons and things, but so I didn't watch a lot of TV, and we moved right after I was in the first grade to Tokyo, where we didn't have a TV. And there was television there, but there were only 2 shows in English. One was I Love Lucy, and I can't remember what the other one was. I think it was a show about truckers called Cannonball. But all the others, they had lots of American shows, but they were all dubbed in. So we just didn't get a TV, and I went for some years then without one. And I read a lot. Books at the library, just the usual books the kids read, the Hardy Boys and the books about baseball players and, elementary school level science fiction books and things like that. And I think it was about 9 when I started reading a little more advanced books, Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer and Penrod and such like. And I read a lot until, I don't know, there was a point in my fiction writing career where I can't remember when it was, but sometime in the last 15 years, maybe the last 20 years, I just haven't read that much fiction. I read like Chekhov. I read a lot of, the only fiction I really read is stuff in translation. And I don't know why. I just like the sound of translated literature. I don't know why. I find myself, I can't turn the critic off. When I start reading a book, I start wanting to correct some of the, I want to change the word order of the first sentence. It just gets, it's in the way. So nowadays I read a lot less than I watch TV. I think I'm one of those people who watches at least a couple of hours of television a day. And I watch sitcoms. The sitcom reruns. They're like plays. They're like half-hour plays. The sets are usually very few, and the characters are few, and they depend on dialogue, characterization, and of course they're funny. And so I spend a lot of time watching TV, and when I read, I read strange books. I refer to it as my endless researches into nothing. It's hard to describe what they are. A lot of like 15th century, 14th century German mystics, strange books, I'd say. So I think the answer is maybe.
Yeah. Yeah. Was there any kind of reading along the way that kind of made you turn a corner and suddenly see it as writing as opposed to Hardy Boys and
when I was in
adventure
high
kind of
school,
stories?
I started to, well, even before that, I mean, books like Tom Sawyer, I felt now here was something that expressed the dilemmas of being a human, small American boy, in any era. And same with Penrod. I gravitated toward books like that, and I could see right away that there were books that made me feel less alone, that confirmed my impressions about experience. Then later on, there were books about adolescence. Of course, I think probably still young people read Catcher in the Rye. Mm-hmm. When my own son was about 14, 6 or 7 years ago, he picked it up and read it and was very, moved by it. And there were just books of that kind that I just felt there was this thing that could happen. You walk into the library, you just go along the shelves, some title catches your eye, you check it out, read it, and it makes you feel so much more at home on the earth. And I felt so grateful to these people. And I was already claiming I wanted to be a writer because that was the only thing I could do in school that sort of mollified the authorities or made me credible to them in any way. So I sort of felt, well, it's a worthy thing to do. I want to do this for somebody else. I want to make a book that is on the library shelves that some kid will read and feel comforted by. And that's not an uncommon experience. I think it's, a high percentage of us get into it because of that very kind of experience.
Mm-hmm. And then continuing with the idea of reading, were there certain writers that became kind of what you would call literary influences, or you modeled yourself after either?
Thousands of writers. I went through many phases. I'd say the first literary influence was who wrote Penrod? Booth Tarkington. That was the first one where I read it and I thought, somebody who's got to write a book about me. And, this guy is close, but he's not, it takes place in the early 1900s. And somebody's got to write a book about me, and I think it better be me. And so that was the first time I set out to write a novel. I was 9 or 10 years old, and I believe Penrod was writing a novel too. In his adventures, one of the things he did was hide out and write a novel. And I thought, that is a good idea. So I hid out and I wrote a novel. And it was very much like Penrod, only it was about me. and actually that pattern has continued ever since. There, one way or another, I'm imprinted by a lot of different authors. Mm-hmm. Well, I think one of the books that really influenced me was Fat City by Leonard Gardner. He only wrote this one book, and it's a novel about two boxers. The experiences and the circumstances of their lives are not at all like mine, but the attitude he took toward his characters in this book and the tender and matter-of-fact way in which he talked about them made me want to write books. I mean, I just felt that this is how I want to see the world, and this is how I want to help others see the world and to see the, some of the more broken up people in it. And man, I read that book a lot. And eventually, when I finished my first novel, my first published novel, it was called Angels, I read the published version of my first novel, and it sounds like, to me, as if it was written by Leonard Gardner. It just, it's not even an imitation. It's just a fact that his diction and perspective had imprinted themselves on me.
Yeah, it's an amazing book, and I think I can see that in Angels too. There's something about it's the people in it are so roughed up, but the prose is so sort of kind of
it tends to dignify them by writing about their world as if it matters.
Yeah,
it doesn't dismiss them. It's very generous toward them without sentimentalizing them. But along the way, there have been many others. I mean, I've gone through a Robert Stone period, and there's a whole section in the Angels book that I think goes into Robert Stone country and then kind of comes out later. And kind of late, like in early 1990, I discovered Cormac McCarthy. The next book I wrote was, trying to be like Cormac McCarthy. Who else is? I mean, there have been many. Isaac Babel is a big influence on me, and I think reading his short stories kind of gave me the permission to write the crazy kind of jumbled up story that you find in Jesus' Son. It's just lucky for me that I picked a foreigner to imitate. I haven't been caught on that one so much as I have been on others. I hate to be busted on these things, but in fact, sometimes people ask, who's your favorite writer? And when I'm telling the truth, I say, I am my favorite writer. Because when I read something by me, I hear all these people, all my other, all my favorite writers, they're all in there, all in one thing,
Just to kind of extend that a little bit, what is the usefulness of influences for, developing writers,
Well, I think it just gives you,
how does it?
It gives you encouragement and it grants you permission. I think that's the main thing it does. I think there is a period we go through when we begin to read technically, and that I think is when we're at the end of the enjoyable part of our careers as readers. And then we're looking at how it's done, and then we get, from our influences, we get deeper understanding of technique and some ideas about just tricks and stratagems, simple prose stratagems.
Where does a work start for you? I mean, is it something you hear? Do you have to hear the sound of the sentences?
I think it usually starts with something auditory. I do know where Angels started. I was on a Greyhound bus, and it was really late at night, and I heard a woman in the back abusing her child and saying, move your foot. I'm tired now. Move your foot, or I'm going to have the bus driver stop the bus, and we're going to put you off the bus in the dark, and we are going to drive away. And I don't know, that just stuck with me for a long time. And I kept thinking about that woman, and eventually she became one of the main characters in a novel. And I didn't really dislike her when I heard her talking. I mean, I could understand it was late. And in fact, the kid was a nuisance for all of us on that bus. I wouldn't have minded a bit if she'd, gone ahead and done it. But that's one that I can vividly remember, the very germ for that. And it just, it took 12 years before that book was finished, and it went through many kind of incarnations, but she was always there. And her bus ride, it begins on the bus with her saying that to her kid. That was always the beginning of the book. And other characters started to take over and become prominent in the book, and I didn't know how to deal with them. And it really went on for a long time. I sort of knew they would go to prison, and there was quite a bit I was willing to do in the way of research, but I wasn't willing to go to prison. But eventually a job opened up teaching in a prison, and I practically held the interviewing committee hostage until they gave me the job so I could go, see what prison life was like, because I knew these guys were going to go there. And that was when I was able to finish that book, actually.
And it was 12 years?
Yeah, it took about 12 years. Yeah. The first chapter was written when I was about 20, and the last one was written when I was about 33. So that's 33. Yeah, so that's like 13 years.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I've been asking people to give me questions, and here's one that maybe I can jack into this. How in the world do you create structure in the midst of such amazing chaos?
A particular book, or?
Well, it says especially in reference to Jesus' Son, but I think it's how does a story find its form, or how do you?
I wrote during my early 20s. I wrote quite a number of stories actually that just weren't any good. I mean, I was operating in a fog, And I did have a typewriter, a series of typewriters, and I did write, but nothing ever really held together. I didn't even save any of the stuff. And I wrote a novel too, come to think of it. I didn't save that either. It just wasn't working. But when I began writing that Jesus Son, it was because there were stories I told people, just anecdotes that I told people, things that had happened to me during that period when I should have been writing books, but was really just getting messed up. And people would always say, you should write that down. You should make that into a story. And I'd always say, nah, once you tell it, you can't make it into a story. I don't know who told me that, but maybe I told me that and I believed it. But one day I went upstairs in my house in Wellfleet, Massachusetts, and I wrote like 4 of these anecdotes down, or 3.5 of them, say. And I really liked the voice. What I liked about it was that there was a double voice. I was now 35 years old, but I was writing about stuff that happened when I was 18, 19, and so on. And there was this kind of perspective of the older person and then getting caught up in the voice of the younger person. And I had written them very quickly, and there was no revision. And if I forgot something, if I forgot the beginning, I would just have to say, well, I forgot to say what happened at the beginning and so on. And I like that. Mm-hmm. But as to the form of the stories, I can actually answer you as a student of those stories. There was a period of some years when I gave readings and I had those stories to read, and I went through that book. I would give 3 or 4, 5 readings a year. And I would just start at the beginning of the book, and then the next reading I gave, I'd read a couple of those stories. The next reading, I'd read the next couple. And I read that book out loud to myself as well as to the audiences several times, all the way through. And I began to see how they were operating. Most of these were anecdotes from my life, and then I began to borrow from other people's lives. And they were the kind of things you would say, and they're kind of interesting. But what is funny about the form of those stories is that in order to make them feel as if a statement had been made or a story had been told, I would put a couple of these anecdotes together. So if you look at those tales, they often consist of 2 anecdotes put side by side, and there's a suggestion that somehow they're related. And there's a strange tension that I think is created by the fact that they're clearly not related. And it just gets, it gets strange. And I ran out of stuff from my own life pretty quickly and started borrowing from others, as I say. And this story, Emergency, which some of you may have read, I wrote the beginning of it down. It was based on an experience a friend of mine had at a hospital where we worked. I did not have this experience. I was not on the shift when this guy came in with a knife in his head. And I wrote that down, and it seemed fine. But that's all there was. There was no more to say. And I moved to Idaho some years, like 3 or 4 years after I had written that first part of the story. And I had this cowboy friend who we were canoeing one day, and he was telling me all these stories, one of which included this experience he had where he and his friend were drinking, driving around in a truck, and they ran over a rabbit, and the guy insisted that they open it up and eat it, and there were little bunnies inside. And that whole story came from what this man told me. Mm. So I went home and wrote that down. Mm-hmm. And later on, I showed him the story. It was in a magazine, and I gave him the magazine. He read a lot. He was an avid reader. I said, you should read this because I used your story. And he's never said anything to me one way or the other about it. But that's just a case where something more had to happen, and I waited, and eventually another anecdote came along, and 2 came together. And in fact, anecdote is a Greek term for unpublished piece. It's something that is not meant to be published. And I did not intend to publish these stories. But I had 7 of them before I ever showed them to anybody. At that point, I was out of money, and I gave them to my agent, and he managed to sell some and so on. But it was just, I never thought anybody would ever see those. I thought they were too revealing. And eventually, I just reached a point where I thought, who cares what I reveal about me? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Too revealing. Well, that brings us to another one of the questions, which kind of came up in workshop, and I got this here. When you draw upon your personal life and life experiences, I guess, for your fiction, how do you deal with or treat friends, relatives that are part of that memory? I think the further question is, what, if any, type of obligation do you feel towards them? And this was one of the students' kind of burning question for herself, I think.
It's a tricky, I mean, it's not tricky. You either do it or you don't. But the thinking about it, I think, can get complicated. Now, in fact, once you read a couple of book reviews about your own work, and once, having seen one or two interviews where the reporter is completely mistaken about what the hell I thought I said, you begin to see that there's no point caring about what is in print about you, and particularly not when it's fictionalized. But people who haven't had this experience of seeing anything about them in print before will feel violated. They will feel as if what they're seeing is an attempt to represent them, and that this attempt has been a callous failure, that there was no care taken in presenting their story properly as they remember it, as they experienced it. And, I might be able to sit down with them and say, look, it's just a story, and it's not really about you. I just happen to feel I have a calling to make stories from all human experience, whether it's mine or not. And it's not really your experience. It's just filtered through, my secondhand understanding of what it was and so on. But they will feel violated. And I have to respect that they will feel violated. And at the same time that I'm aware that they are incorrect in believing that they have been violated. They really haven't. So, for myself, I just go ahead and do it. And they have every right to say whatever they care to. And if they can persuade me that I shouldn't feel this way, then I will retract everything I've written. And, I don't know what I'll do. I can't do anything else. But it is definitely an issue.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think maybe at some point we should just turn it over to the audience.
I will say, just before we take the questions, when it comes to revealing myself, I've stopped caring completely. And in fact, it's now I'm way over on the other side. There's something that Cioran says, Emile Cioran says, you should write only about those things that you would never confide in anyone. And I think that's a great place to go. Emile Cioran, Cioran, a Romanian philosopher, aphorist who writes in French. He has a book called, for instance, The Heights of Despair.
Temptation to Exist.
He's the temptation to exist. Another thing he says is, a novel is a postponed suicide. Okay, go ahead, pick them out.
So my apologies for jumping in like this, but what comes after this in the recording is a series of questions and answers from the audience. The problem is that the questions are nearly inaudible, but given that some of them provoke wonderful answers from Denis, I've decided to keep two of them here as a great way to end. So before I play them, I wanted you to know what the two questions are. Two discrete questions by different people that nevertheless produce two responses that are connected and build on each other. The first question is simply, what is your favorite Bob Dylan lyric? And the second question after he answers the first is, does the manuscript you read from have a title? And was it always the same title over its 22 years of you working on it? And with that, I'll return it back to Denis Johnson.
Okay, go ahead, pick them out. Well, it's mostly lines and fragments and things like that. The beginning of Desolation Row, they're selling postcards at the hanging. They're painting the passports brown. The beauty parlor's filled with sailors. The circus is in town. I love that opening. And that line, I think it's from Memphis Blues. Somebody gave me two cures. The Rain Man gave me two cures. What comes after that? One was Texas medicine and the other was railroad gin. And like the fool, I mixed them, and they strangled up my mind, and now people just get uglier, and I have no sense of time. But there are so many. I mean, he is one of the authors that has imprinted me. I think he's a great poet, but he's not exactly a versifier, you know. I mean, his work I would call literature rather than poetry. It's culturally very, very key, I think.
Does the book have a title, and if so, has it changed in the 22 years?
Yeah, the book, it has changed. It was called The Years for many years. Recently, in the last 5 or 6 years, it's been called Tree of Smoke. And that comes from, partly from the Bible. The literal translation of pillar of smoke is tree of smoke, or actually palm tree of smoke. Same with pillar of fire. I met this religious painter by the name of Norbert Cox, who he has done, among other things, like a 53-foot-long painting of the Bible and so on. He's one of these sort of primitive guys. And he was the one who told me tree of smoke is, you know, a very important phrase in the Bible. And then later on, I heard a verse from a song called Angelina by Bob Dylan, where it says, beat a path of retreat up them spiral staircases, past the tree of smoke, past the angel with 4 faces, crying out to God and praying in unholy places. So that these are all, you know, they're different. No, wait a minute. Crying out to God and weeping in unholy places. And these are all just sort of contexts in which this phrase occurs. And it means something in the book, too, something entirely different. Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much for your time.
Today's program was recorded at the volunteer-powered, non-commercial, listener-sponsored, full-strength, makeshift home office of me, David Naiman. If you enjoyed today's conversation, consider joining the Between the Covers community as a listener supporter and help keep this quixotic endeavor going into the future. Every supporter can join our brainstorm of future guests, and every listener supporter receives the supplementary resources with each conversation of things I discovered while preparing, things referenced during it, and places to explore once you're done listening. Additionally, there are a variety of other potential gifts and rewards, including the bonus audio archive, which includes supplementary contributions from past guests, from readings to craft talks to long-form conversations with translators. There's also the Tin House Early Readership subscription, getting 12 books over the course of a year, months before they're available to the general public. Rare collectibles from past guests, or a bundle of books selected and curated by me and sent to you. You can find out more at patreon.com/betweenthecovers. Or if you prefer a one-time donation, you can do so by PayPal at tinhouse.com/support. I'd like to thank the Tin House team, Elizabeth DeMeo and Elisa Ogie in the book division, Beth Steidel in the art department, Becky Kramer and Isabel Lemus Christensen in publicity, and Lance Cleland, the director of the Summer and Winter Tin House Writers Workshops. Finally, I'd like to thank past Between the Covers guest, poet, musician, composer, performer, and much more, Alicia Jo Ravens, for making the intro and the outro for the show. You can find out more about her work, her writing, her music, her film, at aliciajo.com. ALICIAJO.com.